So the government's plan to ban conversion therapy appears to have been dropped. It doesn't appear in the King's speech, but Labour are promising to have a full-blown ban on conversion therapy that would include trans people. James, I want you to explain a bit of the dangers about that. But first of all, do you want to explain your declaration for biological reality and what that is about before we go on to conversion therapy?
Sure, yeah. So I along with 20 plus organisations, launched this declaration Monday gone, simply because we had enough. Our position is that gender ideology has infected all areas of society. It's risking children's welfare, women's rights, the rights of gay and lesbian people, and also free speech in this country. And we need to do something about it. And so, this declaration has a series of demands for politicians under all of those headings. And, it's been great to see the support that's been had for it. We've, I think, got about 17,000 signatures in a few days. And the signatories are, from across the political spectrum.
Yeah.
And I'm saying that this isn't about right or left, it's about right and wrong. And I think our signatories definitely show that. So I'm hoping that this can at least get some of the dialogue starting, because no one can say, that this ideology hasn't taken over society. One only needs to look at the primary school textbooks that the children are being exposed to. One only needs to look at some of the sporting competitions and some of the, completely unfair practices that have been taking place there, or the people who have been cancelled, lost their jobs and livelihoods for daring to say that a man cannot become a woman.
And in terms of where does the plan to ban conversion therapy fit into this? Because it is many sort of gender critical people have raised the alarm about this as problematic.
Well, it's a misnomer in and of itself, using the word therapy. And actually, one of the government spokespeople a few years ago acknowledged this, because this isn't taking place, in therapy rooms up and down the country. These type of practices are actually usually taking place in private families, or even usually, I think, in religious settings as well. But there's a lot of misinformation out there, because the other side will say, we need to stop the torture of trans children. And I'll say, the last time I checked, torture was already illegal in this country. And that's the thing. All of these horrific practices, such as electroshock therapy, corrective rape, were criminalized a long, long time ago. And, thank God for that. But this legislation would ban talking therapies, explorative therapies with children for what is a mental health condition.
And would that sort of push therapists into taking a kind of affirmation approach, where they have to say, they have to agree with a patient that if they say they're a girl, they're a girl?
Correct. It would essentially create a bunch of kind of robotic nodding dogs, and it would lead us to treating gender dysphoria in a way that we don't treat any other mental health condition. It's not a therapist's job to simply nod along with whatever their client or patient is telling them. Part of their ethical responsibility is to explore and even potentially challenge the things that the clients are saying to them.
Yeah.
And certainly to embrace reality over delusion. And so if we come from a position that, people are not born in the wrong body, they cannot change sex, therapists, whilst being empathetic and respectful towards their clients, should be exploring these factors. So it's really quite concerning. I mean, it's not in the King's speech. That doesn't mean that it's not going to be introduced. And actually, just today I saw that they showed the ballot for the private members' bills in the House of Lords, and topping that is a private members' bill trying to ban conversion therapy.
Right, so. And with Labour supporting it, maybe that could come in before the election, but obviously it could happen if Labour win the next election.
Yeah.
And Tom, given that a substantial proportion of people who present as trans will grow up to be gay, isn't there a deeper irony in this, calling it conversion therapy, if you're essentially going to force people down a sort of trans affirmative pathway?
No, I'm glad you brought that up. And the LGB Alliance have been very good at highlighting this particular grim and potentially quite disastrous irony, which is to say that, as you suggest, there's an awful lot of children who present as trans, who believe themselves to be trans, who turn out just to be essentially struggling with their sexuality. So if you put that fact next to the fact that this ban would effectively mandate a kind of affirmative approach, you end up with a form of gay conversion therapy. You end up with a form of effectively taking a child who will just grow up to be a happy homosexual individual and fixing them in this kind of sense. And it's again one of those things, and as you say, James, this is a very much kind of cross-political issue, and that's been very comforting to see. But at the same time, there is something incredibly unprogressive, incredibly reactionary about a lot of this politics. We talk a lot about the impact on women's rights, which of course is a very clear example of that, but also the fact that the threat it poses, not just to gay rights and so on, but even just to gay individuals, if you like, at that really tricky stage of development where they might be struggling both with their own feelings about themselves, the feelings about the way in which their families are dealing with them. I mean, there's been, without wanting to name names, there's been many cases of people basically saying they trans their child because they were gay and that various members of their family were uncomfortable with that. That's a recurring trope you see in a lot of these stories. Does that not make people have some pause and think about this? Surely you would think so, but I think people just prefer to ignore it, prefer to pose with the little placard saying we're against trans conversion therapy and not actually think about any of these issues. You know, the virtue signalling is more important than actually being virtuous in this sense.
I want to move on to talk about possibly a more amusing side of the trans story. So the 2021 census has quite famously introduced a sort of question asking people if they're trans for the first time. Now, it turns out a lot of people, especially if they're foreign, didn't quite understand the question. So we now believe that there are over 200,000 trans people in the UK, but strangely, 1 in 67 Muslims are trans, according to the data. The highest number of trans people is actually in Newham, in London.
Queer capital of Europe.
The queer capital of Europe. More trans people there than in Brighton, mainly because it has the highest concentration of foreign-born people. So the ONS have admitted there might be some local problems, but they've sort of stood by their overall data. What have you made of this, James?
Oh, the whole thing is a complete and utter farce, you know, and they clearly got this wrong. I mean, they were warned about the language from the very outset and that this was going to confuse people. They pushed on with it anyway, and now that it's come to bite them, they've become very defensive, and they're acknowledging that that this could have skewed the data, although they've been quite defensive about it. I mean, this will come as an upset to some individuals, including Nancy Kelly, the former CEO of Stonewall, because when those initial results came out, and she lives in one of the London boroughs where there was a particularly high tranche of trans people, supposedly, she said on Twitter that she wanted to come out and just shout hello into the street and see all of her siblings, her trans siblings, kind of come and speak with her. So she'll be disappointed by that. But yes, I mean, this just goes to show, actually, that this is what happens when you manipulate language. You know, it's difficult enough for someone who's got English as their first language to get their heads around this, let alone somebody who's come from abroad and English as a second or third language. So.
I mean, and Tom, I mean, there's like a substantial number of people, according to a lot of polls, who don't actually know that transgender women are male, for instance. So people are very confused about this topic.
Exactly. Even people who probably read a newspaper every day and people who you know, feel like they're kind of engaged in the debates in society, people who do have English as a first language. This is incredibly obfuscating and confusing, but I think it's kind of designed to be to a certain extent. I think there's, not to be conspiratorial about it, but there's this kind of sense of you can only really have out this discussion if you're really into it. You know, if you're someone who's properly credentialed, if you're someone who has all of the right opinions on it, that it's something that, you know, the great unwashed shouldn't really deal with because they probably have horrible views about it anyway. So it is always, it's been fascinating the way in which the discussion and the shift in policies and all of these things that we've been sort of talking about on this show and on Spike, how much it really happens at a level that people are either not aware of it, encouraged not to engage with it, and even if they did try to engage with it, probably wouldn't understand it in the first place. And that, I think, is a big part of the reason that things have got so extreme without anyone really noticing in wider society. I think that's a big part of the picture, definitely.